Hello, I'm Stephen Bunt, and welcome to my midterm video assignment. I'm going to take a little time here to talk about some things that I've learned in the course so far, and a few topics in particular that I thought were both interesting and relevant today's social and business climate. So, a few of the things I wanted to talk about today are going to be capitalism, socialism, and then ethically and social responsibility in the workplace. So that last one is a group of concepts covered in chapter 4 mostly. But I thought it was really interesting, and so I'd like to get into a little bit of that here today. So again, welcome to my midterm, and let's get started. So first we're going to go ahead and start off with capitalism, which I'm sure you've heard of. And so capitalism, as defined in the textbook anyway here, is an economic system in which all or most of the means of production and distribution are privately owned and operated. So capitalism generally is referring to the private owning of the means of production. So you've got a right to own your own land, you've got a right to own your own business, and actually the textbook specifically states 4 rights that go along with capitalism. The right to own private property, pretty self-explanatory, makes sense, at least if you're a U.S. citizen, you have the right to own property. So the second right is the right to own a business and the right to keep all of that business's profits. The third right is the right to freedom of competition. And so that, we'll touch on that a little bit later, but that has to do with, you can't just develop a monopoly or control all factors of a certain type of business in your area while you have the freedom to build up and do that in one sense. That's not fair to others who may potentially be starting a business, right? Or basically there's a right to compete, a right to the freedom of competition. No one business is supposed to get so big and so powerful that it can just crush any of the competition, right? So that would not foster a positive business environment, at least as far as capitalism is concerned, which we'll touch on more. And then finally is the right to the freedom of choice. So those are the 4 basic rights that people have under capitalism. On that last one, the freedom of choice, makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because you've got both the people making the business, right? So you've got the right and the freedom to set up a business. But then you also need customers, you need consumers who have the right to freely associate and choose what business they're going to want to go to, right? So I don't know if you could fairly call it a business if you create some giant monopolistic company. You're the only store in town, you're the company store, right? You're the only place in town, and much less if you could force your customers to buy from you, that's not good business practice. That's certainly not fair. And that's, at least under the capitalist system, that's why it's one of the rights under capitalism. So that last one, the freedom of choice, is particularly important because it also encourages competition, right? So by having the freedom of choice, both the person making the business and both the educated consumers, or uneducated, both the individuals, you got the choice of where you're going to go, what you're going to buy, how much you're going to pay for it. And so all of those things together work particularly well in what we know as the free market system. So now there's actually like different types of capitalism, like state capitalism, which we'll discuss a little bit later here. But at least in the United States, we operate what's called the free market. So we operate under a free market system, and that has a lot to do with the freedom of choices that dictate the market and how the market works. So it's individuals acting of their own free will, choosing what they want to buy, what they want to sell, what they'll work for, what their labor is worth. Ownership and freedom and ownership of your own labor is actually really important too, at least in a capitalist system and in a free market system in particular. So in the free market, it's buyers and sellers negotiating prices for goods and services, and that supply and demand is going to determine then how much of certain products are produced and what people are going to pay for them. So all of that functions under the realm of free market capitalism there. But again, so that's just a basic rundown of what capitalism is there. Again, an economic system in which all or most of the means of production and distribution are privately owned and operated for profit. All right, so now let's move on to socialism. So, at least in this climate, if you turn on the news for more than 2 seconds, especially with the elections coming up, there's a lot of talk about socialism, which is relevant. It makes sense. There's lots of people unhappy with many parts of the way things are running here in the U.S. currently. So it's important to understand what socialism really is and what it means. So as the text defines it, socialism is an economic system based on the premise that some businesses should be ran by the government. So socialism is referring to the operation of certain businesses, key businesses or key goods and services usually is what they refer to. Things like healthcare, production of food, maybe production of steel, some of the basic things that you need, to survive or to keep a society functioning. Certain things, key resources that are important to a business, it's having those ran and operated and owned by the government rather than by individuals. So less emphasis on private property and private ownership, and more on, this is a good that's important and vital to everyone, so, maybe the government or some governing body should own it so that they can redistribute it appropriately. And that actually leads us to one of the advantages of socialism, actually, is that since there's a governing body that's in charge of these key resources, rather than individuals under a capitalist system, they're able to redistribute them fairly to people who need it. One of the sad realities that we're seeing in real time and that scientists are actually finding out more about is that inequality is a real issue. It's a real danger in society currently. So there's some argument as to what can be done about it, which is where this discussion about socialism comes in. The idea being that, if all of the wealth or if all the resources are piling up and amassing at the top of the 1% perhaps, it leaves a lot of people down at the bottom not so well off, right? And so under a socialist system, the idea is that if you take these basic needs, these basic goods and services, and put them not under the control of any one individual, but under the control of the government or a governing body, they can redistribute those to people who need them more. So that's one of the main advantages. A disadvantage of socialism is that it discourages and it gets rid of the incentives to start businesses or to work harder within those businesses, which you can understand that a little bit. If you work really hard and you create more profit, to find out that that's just going to be redistributed, it's a classic argument you usually hear, about socialist policies. Is it encourages laziness is what you might hear, because why work harder if you're just going to get benefits if you don't work hard? And then the opposite side is, why should you work harder to create more wealth that then you're not going to get to keep? It's going to be redistributed. So but that's one of the disadvantages, is it not as much incentive to start new businesses or to work harder. Apparently, one thing I thought was interesting, I didn't know this, was that apparently socialist economies have higher unemployment rates, and the growth is slower, but that unemployment was actually surprising. So when we're talking about like the differences between capitalism and socialism, and whether people have the right to their own labor, to the profits of their hard work, or whether or not there's a common interest in maybe redistributing some of these to better off your whole community or your whole society, I think it's interesting to talk about the ethics and some issues regarding corporate responsibility. So one thing I found was really interesting is at the beginning of the text, it talks about the invisible hand. And so that's an idea that basically goes along the lines of, so businesses aren't necessarily starting up in order to provide a good or service for society, that's kind of an accidental byproduct, right? The invisible hand suggests more that, well, if you as a private business owner are acting in your own best interest, trying to make yourself a profit, that in the act of doing that, you're actually going to create all these extra good forces in your community and around you. And that the process that creates those good forces, taking your own personal motivation and your personal push for profit, and the I guess I'm going to call them accidental byproducts of good things happening around you, that's referred to as the invisible hand. So one idea is that, hey, you know what, you just run your business, you do your thing, you try to make your money, right? You're not setting out specifically to do any good, you're just trying to make yourself some money. And then good things are going to happen, because if you build a business, right, well, now you're going to have to if you grow, right, you're going to hire other people. That's creating jobs. You are also, in theory, selling a good or a service to the community, so that increases what's available to your local community. And then it just goes from there. You know, if you grow bigger, then maybe these people get health insurance, maybe they get benefits. There's all these sort of things. So I thought there was an interesting contrast to be made, and perhaps that the invisible hand gets proven wrong a little bit in chapter 4 when we start talking about corporate social responsibilities. So one of the first things that struck me is, you know, if there's this invisible hand that says I can act, for lack of a better term, selfishly, not necessarily in a bad way, but if I can act selfishly and just trying to make as much money as I can for myself or my business and let the other products of that do good for society, well, then why is there all this push for corporate responsibility? In the day of social media, like, it's almost dangerous for a company to let slip what its certainly political leanings are, but it's so much easier for people to take sides without really understanding the full background or the full context. So we have this new age here of corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility, as defined by the text, is the concern businesses have for society. So I feel like there's a little bit of a conflict there between, well, why should this business have any direct concern for society if the invisible hand is just going to take care of things? It's important to think about what responsibilities businesses actually do have to society. I think there's a really strong argument to be made that if you're a business and you're hiring people in your community, you know, and you're selling products, you exist as a business not solely because of some business makers, some corporate leaders' genius ideas, or some entrepreneur's industrial spirit, right? The business doesn't exist in a vacuum only off of that premise. You wouldn't have a business if there weren't people to buy your goods. So at a very basic level, we can see there that, well, a business does actually have some responsibility to its customers or to its clients. So when we talk about ethical behavior in a business, there's an important distinction to be made about legal versus moral, or what's usually defined as socially acceptable. Because people are going to react based on their own morals and values, which means that what's socially acceptable for a business can actually fluctuate and change over time if it's not only tied to what's legal. So what people think is right or wrong changes. That's fairly obvious. In the text, it suggests one of the ways that you as an employee or you working in a business, there's 3 questions you want to ask yourself to determine if what you're doing or what your company is doing is actually moral. So you want to ask, is it legal? You always want to start there, because it's not perfect, but for the most part, we try to align our laws and our rules so that they're in line with what's morally good, right? So if there's laws, if there's something that's legal but it's morally bad, that's usually something we want to try and scrub from society. So and from a business standpoint, there's obvious ramifications if you do something that's illegal. So one of the first questions you want to ask is it legal? Is it balanced is the second question. And then how does it make you feel? So as far as it being balanced, I interpreted that as an example might be if you're running some industrial factory, you know, somewhere in the Midwest, maybe along the Mississippi River or something. Balanced would have to do with, is it really okay for you to be dumping your waste right into the river? You may be making insane profits by cutting a cost there, but it's not really balanced when you look at the impact that your chemical waste is going to have by dumping it in a river, right? So you want to think about, is it legal? Number one. Is it balanced? Number two. And then the third is, how does it make you feel? And that one, I feel it is important to ask yourself. I do worry about that as being a good barometer for whether your behavior is ethical in a corporate sense or in a business, simply because, feelings are subjective, and there's some things that are bad that people may feel neutral or not have a strong visceral reaction to, that other people might instantly recognize as being bad or wrong. So, but that's why those three questions in tandem, they balance each other, right? When trying to determine if your behavior in a business setting is ethical, is it legal? Is it balanced? How does it make you feel? So that's my midterm video. I look forward to learning a lot more, and thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.